Since the official release of Company was free, the reviews of the game has been quite diverse. I just want to welcome you first of all to my channel, or welcome you back to my channel. I am Jinx, and in this video I will be talking about the biggest pros and cons of Company Heroes 3. Let's see why. So let's begin with the downside of the game. So number 1, locked texture settings. So immediately when you go into your settings of the game, you will notice that the textures settings may be locked. This may not be an issue for all of you, but for most of us this would be the case. So unfortunately they have locked texture settings, not allowing us to increase the details or the textures of the game depending on the type of GPU you have. So it has been mentioned that if you have a GPU that is less than 16 gig RAM, unfortunately you will not be able to run the settings from max or to ultra, as this may cause lower FPS, which is quite unfortunate. I am running a PC that is not 16 gig RAM, however I am, or I should be able to run settings according to what I desire. I do get a quite high frame rate, however I would happily increase the textures to get a bit more detail in my gameplay, sacrificing some of the frames per second, which I am happy to do. Finally becomes one of my main concerns for the game. On number 2, rushing tanks. So this one is a bit of a familiar one, and I certainly myself have experienced this in past Company of Heroes games. So all you gamers out there might already have experienced this yourselves too. So if you haven't noticed, or for those who have not seen it yet, rushing tanks, or those tanks, and not even just tanks, vehicles as well, just rushing the lines as if they have no threat in front of them. So we would have such a situation where the tank will get absolutely obliterated, and still the tank or the enemy tanks, the AI behind these tanks, will still push the tanks forward, and not only push the tanks forward, but they will actually drive behind you all the way to the back lines and just keep pushing until they reach the edge or reach your base, and they will just ignore the fact that they have just went through swarms of fire and anti-tank. They disregard everything. So unfortunately this is added to my list. Rushing tanks is something that I do not like to see, and I hope maybe in future this may be amended or something is done. But unfortunately rushing tanks just takes away the realism of the game and the seriousness and the immersion of your the strategy that you want to do within the game. Con number 3, Super Soldier. Similar to the previous one, Super Soldier is basically the enemy infantry or enemy troops will almost just never die, which kind of falls into the category that I am about to discuss after this. But just a bit more specific on the soldier itself. The soldier will tend to just approach enemies as if they're invulnerable, and this is kind of a gray area. The reason being is because it is known in history, in our previous conflicts, that infantry would intentionally push themselves across the front line, even though under heavy fire, taking many casualties, will push themselves to gain that little bit of ground. So in that perspective, it does make sense that in the game they will make the AI push themselves to gain ground. However, there are extremes. Even though gaining ground intentionally does make sense, the infantry does tend to take damage, barely any damage. After being under heavy fire, they still seem to not die realistically, which is why I've named this one Super Soldier. Even though this is one of the flaws I have spotted, it has been known already in previous games, and it does seem like this is just how the game is. And this brings me to my next point. On number 4, arcadey gameplay. Let's be honest, if you wanted to play a historically realistic RTS game, it would not be Company of Heroes. The game presents a sense of unrealistic combat, such as mentioned before. Certain troops or units get shot and they do not die as if realistically they should do. You would use flamethrowers and they will still experience the burns and still not die instantly or fairly instantly, to say the least. Tanks will just rush into your base or rush through the front lines as if there poses no threat against them. However, with this said, the game does seem to intentionally do this, and I do just want to reassure that even though the game is very arcadey, fun outside a very strict RTS realism game. On number 5, UI, user interface. Although the user interface currently is not really that much of an issue, and it does show a good amount of detail, clear and simple, nothing has really changed from, let's say, the previous version and the current version of the user interface. The UI does feel a bit big as it was before. It would have been nice if the UI would have been minimized, something a bit more smaller, still explaining or showing all the detail it has currently. Although I've mentioned that it's not something of a deal, but it would still be nice to have something a bit more downsized per se. Now hold up. Despite all of the negative aspects of this game, let's move on to the things I quite enjoy and really appreciate about this game. Let's move on to the pros. Pro number 1, campaign mechanics. Similar to the Total War franchise, Company of Heroes 3 has implemented a new mechanic, a turn-based style gameplay, which I find this more engaging since it now allows you to dictate the campaign, giving you a bigger picture of the story, allowing you to go offensive or defensive as you please. This gives the player a more detailed campaign, having to think about every decision carefully, as opposed to the previous Company of Heroes 2 game. I perceive the map-to-map type campaign to be quite less creative. Pro number 2, tactical pause. This is something I've been long waiting for ever since I've started playing Company of Heroes as a whole. It's something that I wish that I could just suddenly do while engaged in a battle or very intense battle, and having to handle so many units, troops, tanks and everything all combined, making yourself very overwhelmed at times, especially if you're like me and you don't really play that well. Tactical pause allows you to basically giving you a more better experience when handling troops, mostly for the user-friendly approach to players, but I still find this very nice to have. Pro number 3, attention to detail. There are many details that bring the game to life. Civilians are one of my favorite details of all. During the battles, you would see them react and run away. Other details such as the destruction of buildings and infantry catching on fire. If there's one thing I can assure you, is that you will definitely enjoy these small details that bring big immersion to your battles. Pro number 4, tanks. Everyone just loves tanks. I've included tanks in this list because they just bring so much fun into the game, as they should do. See all the different realistic vehicles engaging in different variety of battles. This is something that is just a must, and just looking at the tank just make it so much alive. Tanks is just amazing. Pro number 5, the Resistance. Last but definitely not least is one of my favorite additions to Company of Heroes 3, Partisans. In certain battles you would see AI controlled partisans fighting alongside you, which makes it certainly incredibly more fun than without them. You are even able to gain partisan HQs, which provides the ability to recruit partisan units. Just being able to have this feature makes it worth being on the pros list. Now that about wraps up my pros and cons list for Company of Heroes 3. Overall, I think the game is definitely worth the try, especially if you enjoy RTS games as much as I do. Another thing I've enjoyed is making this video, and I want to thank you for watching. Leave a like if you want to see more, and also I would much appreciate if you leave any feedback you have for me so that I can improve my videos in the future. I'm gonna leave you guys with flamethrower action. Hey Jinx, out.